Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the lungs and heart chapter of the course pack. This resource is brought to you by the Scrubs team, which is the student collaborative resources for understanding and Brody success. My name is Bryce Pugh, I'm in the class of 2027, and let's start with the mission statement of Scrubs. So Scrubs is a student-driven initiative that aims to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Brody. Members of Scrubs participate in a variety of subcommittees working to create resources for students by students. These resources aim to offer unique perspectives from students that have walked in the same shoes, developing resources that we wish we'd been exposed to during our time in the course. The hope is this organization will become a staple of the Brody student body, exemplifying the unique collaborative community that Brody offers. If this is a mission that aligns with your goals and you have the desire to help those that will come behind you, as well as the goal to leave your mark on Brody as a whole, we invite you to join the team. Also, a quick disclaimer, the resources that are included in this document are made by students, not the faculty. As such, there's a possibility for errors in our development, although this is mitigated via a team approach to development with multiple stages of vetting. If there's a contradiction within the coursework and this video, then always go by the course documents. Additionally, Scrubs aims to supply supplemental resources, but these are in no way replacements to the instruction of the Brody faculty. Use these resources as a supplement, but not your primary source for the course material. And so, with this unit, starting off, we're looking at the lungs and heart. And so we'll look at the lungs first and then move on to the heart. And so when looking at lungs, we're going to be talking about this idea of pleura. And so what pleura are is going to be best understood when looking at lung development. And so the lungs are going to develop, a lot of times people like to use this analogy of a hand into a balloon. And so what that means is we're going to have kind of like these two balloons you can imagine. And the trachea, as it's developing, is going to come down. It's going to be between the balloons, and it's going to start to branch out into those. And so it's going to be like making a fist and pushing it into the balloon. And so we're going to push into the balloon, push into the balloon, push into the balloon, and grow bigger and bigger and bigger, until eventually we have the balloon kind of squished together. And so we're going to have the inner layer of the balloon, the outer layer of the balloon, and then this space that is the inside of the balloon. That space on the inside is going to be the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity is inside the balloon. And then this kind of like outermost layer of the balloon, that's going to be our parietal cavity, our parietal pleura. And parietal, remember, means kind of like wall. And so that's going to be our wall of the pleura, or of the lungs. On the inside, so the inside layer of the balloon that's wrapping directly around the lungs, that's going to be our visceral layer. And so viscera, we're going to talk about a lot when looking at organs and stuff like that. That just means kind of internal. So the more innermost layer is our visceral layer, and that's going to be tightly wrapped around the lungs. It's going to be moist and shiny, and we'll look at the lobes of the lungs, but it's going to follow the fissures and lobes of the lungs. It's also continuous with the parietal pleura. So remember, just like the balloon, these are going to be continuous with each other. It's just going to be split at this point, which is going to be known as the root of the lung. Looking at our parietal pleura, so this outermost layer, we're going to section it off into different pieces just so we can talk about different spots more specifically. And so we're going to name them based on kind of what region of the pleural, of the thoracic cavity that we're looking at. And so that's what's demonstrated in this picture. So first we have our costal pleura, which is going to be running up against our costals, or our ribs. We're going to have our diaphragmatic pleura, which is down here, and that's going to be overlaying the diaphragm. We have mediastinal pleura, which is going to be running next to the mediastinum. And then we have our cervical pleura at the apex, or our pleural cupula up here at the top. Next, let's move on to the pleural cavity. So remember, this is going to be a little more accurate depiction of a lung. We zoom in, and we can see the two parts of the balloon. So we have our parietal pleura on the outside, our visceral pleura on the inside, and our pleural cavity. So our pleural cavity, you'll see that described as a potential space. And this can sound kind of confusing, but really what that means is this is usually going to be closed. So there's not usually going to be a lot of space or a big gap here, because the two pleura are usually going to be smushed up against each other. But there is still a cavity, so there is still a potential for there to be space there, and that's what that means. And so in this pleural cavity, our lungs, specifically mesothelial lining, that's going to secrete this lubricating pleural fluid. And what it does is allows the two kind of like membranes, the two pleura, to rub against each other and move against each other. We're also going to have pleural reflections. And what these are is where our parietal pleura, the outermost layer, are going to fold back or change directions or something when we move from one wall of the pleural cavity to another. And so you can kind of see that how we like change shapes from like this surface to this surface. There's going to be folds here. And then finally, we want to look at the pleural ligament, and that's going to be right here. So we'll look more at this in a second. This is going to be our root of the lung, but that's going to kind of extend down here by the anterior and posterior mediastinal pleura, and they're going to form this ligament here. And then on the other lung, it's going to be right there. Now let's look at pleural recesses. And so a recess, you might be able to gather from the name, is going to be like a cavity or a space that we're not inside of typically. And so our pleural recesses are going to be areas of the pleural cavity where the lungs don't typically extend. And so we have a couple of them that we want to look at here. So they're not typically going to be there, but when we're breathing, then they can expand down into them. And so the two that we're going to look at is the costodiaphragmatic recess and the costomediastinal recess. And so they're named for kind of where they're at. You can see from here the costals, diaphragmatic recess. Up here, so you can see the ribs would be overlaying this region, so it would be costomediastinal recess. At the costodiaphragmatic recess, this is a unique spot because this can be the point where abnormal fluid accumulation can occur, and that can be things like lymph, blood, or pleural fluid, and that can build up here. And so in the clinic, a lot of times doctors will need to come in and alleviate the pressure and remove the fluid in there. And that can be done through thoracentesis, which is essentially just inserting a needle through the body wall into here without actually puncturing the lung. Moving over to our costomediastinal recess, it can't be pictured super well here. Don't get it confused with the cardiac notch. So our heart is going to sit here and kind of cause this indent in the lung over here. But our costomediastinal recess is going to be just around that. And so this is going to be a unique spot because the lung, or the lingula, the left lung is going to have this structure called the lingula, which comes from the root in Latin, which means tongue. And so it's going to be this kind of little tongue of the lung that's going to stick out into the costomediastinal recess. Next, let's look at pain and sensation of pain, because this is kind of unique to these. So our parietal pleura, the outer layer, is going to be innervated by the phrenic and intercostal nerves. And it's therefore going to be pain sensitive. So you can feel pain on the parietal pleura, the outer layer. And so if you were to be experiencing pain there, it's typically going to be deferred or referred over to the intercostal spaces. And that's going to be because, like we said, the intercostal nerves, which are going to be running in the intercostal spaces, are going to be innervating this. So if we have damage, then it's going to be radiated out to the intercostal spaces. Our visceral pleura, the more innermost layer that's more closely lining the lungs, is going to have sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation from the pulmonary plexus. And so this is not going to be pain sensitive. And we'll look a little bit more about innervation of the thorax in another chapter, but that's the main thing you want to pick up here is the visceral pleura is not pain sensitive. The parietal pleura is pain sensitive. And so let's look at a couple more structures in the lungs and just get a better understanding here. So the tip of our lung, the very superior part up here, that's going to be our apex. And then looking down at the bottom, we're going to have a base. And so the base of our lungs is going to be this concave structure or section that's going to be laying up against the diaphragm. The root of the lung, we already talked about a little bit, is going to be right here. And what this is going to do, this is unique because it's the passageway for a lot of structures from the mediastinum into the lungs. And that's going to be things like our pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, and actual bronchi. And so that's the passageway, but the hilum is where the root actually attaches to the lung. And so we can bring that over here. The hilum is going to be this. And so one thing that can be really important to know here, I put it down here, this little mnemonic, is going to be if you are in lab and you just see a lung laying there, if you're not allowed to touch it for a practical or something, you might not be able to identify, well, is this the left or right? And so you want to have a way to identify if this is the left or right lung just by looking at it alone. And you can do that by looking at the relation of the pulmonary artery to the bronchi. And so what you can look at here is RALS, R-A-L-S. And so what that stands for is right anterior, left superior. And so in the right lung, these two purple ones, they're going to be anterior to the lung right here. In the left lung, so LS, left superior, the purple is going to be superior here. And so it won't be purple versus white on a real lung, but you should be able to identify this anterior, posterior versus superior, inferior relationship. So remember that RALS. And then still looking at the lungs, we're going to have a bunch of different surfaces. As you can see, we've got these different folds that separate it into different surfaces. And so we're going to name those based on what they're associating with. So we're going to have our costal surface, which is going to be kind of out here lining up against the costals of the ribs. We'll have our mediastinal surface, which is going to be this surface will be coming out of the page towards us. And then we're going to have our diaphragmatic surface, which is going to be down here lying over the diaphragm. We could also separate it by borders, and so we would have an anterior border, a posterior border, and an inferior border. And so these are all kind of reiterating the same idea. You can imagine inferior is going to be diaphragmatic, posterior is going to be broad, concaving in the thoracic region, so that would be similar to the costal one. And then we have anterior, which is going to be more like the mediastinal surface. It's not going to be exactly the same as this because the lungs are laying a little more sideways in your actual thorax, and so it's going to be a little overlap there. Okay, now we want to look a little more about the structure of the lungs, and so we've kind of hinted at this, and you might have seen this in lab already, but we're going to have different lobes of the lungs. And so the lungs, in a lot of diagrams, you'll see this, they are going to look pretty similar, but they're actually going to look a little bit more different in real life. And so the lungs are going to be kind of split up into different lobes, and those are going to be split by fissures. And so when comparing the right lung to the left lung, we're going to have a few differences. First, the right lung is going to be short and chubby. It's going to be a short, little chubby lung, and it's going to be larger, heavier, but shorter and wider. And the reason that's going to be is because the diaphragm on this side is going to be higher up, and you can keep going down into the abdomen, and you'll see that the liver is going to be just under that, really high up. And so we'll have a short, chubby right lung. And so these lobes are going to be formed by fissures. And in the right lung, we're going to have 3 lobes and 2 fissures. In the left lung, we're going to have 2 lobes and 1 fissure. And so looking at the right lung, we're going to have a superior, a middle, and an inferior lobe. And so the superior and middle are going to be split by this horizontal fissure. The middle and inferior are going to be split by this oblique fissure. And this kind of makes it look like there are 3 perfectly separated little sections. I like this diagram a little bit better just because it's a little more accurate in my opinion. So you'll have your superior lobe, you have a horizontal fissure splitting off the middle lobe, which is kind of like this piece of cake that someone cut out here. And then you'll have your oblique fissure, really big, that's going to separate that from the inferior lobe. Moving over to the left lung, we're also going to have a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. And so the middle one is going to be the different one. And so you can remember that they're both going to have an inferior, or they're both going to have a superior, because those are both describing in relationship to each other. So only on the right lung are we going to have a middle lobe. And so looking back at the left lung, the inferior lobe is going to be located posteriorly in the pleural cavity. And this is actually going to be true for both of them. And so when the lungs are oriented like this, like in the real body, the inferior lobes are going to be located mostly on the back. You can kind of see this here as they're going to be really big on the back. And so this is going to be the reason for why when you're in clinic, if you want to listen to someone's heart, you'll listen on the front. When you want to listen to their lungs and hear them breathing really deep, you want to listen to the bottom, the inferior lobes. And so you're going to put your stethoscope up against their back and have them breathe really deeply. That way you can hear the inferior lobes most clearly. And then a couple things that we've already pointed out, but I want to reiterate. We have the cardiac notch only in the left lung because the heart's going to kind of stick out into this region here. And so we'll have our cardiac notch, and then that's somewhat going to form this lingula, which is the tongue of the left lobe. So our left lobe licks the heart, so lingula. And now let's move over to the trachea. And so we've talked about this a little bit when we were in the head and neck chapter with the pharynx and larynx. So we had our larynx. That's going to continue down into the trachea. And so this is our airway down to our lungs. So we're going to travel down and we're going to bifurcate at the sternal angle. And we're going to go into the left and right bronchi. And so these could be identified as primary bronchi, and we'll later see that they're going to split even more. But at this split where we become primary bronchi from the trachea, we're going to have this little spot here that I kind of boxed in, and that's going to be where the two bronchi share a wall medially. And this is going to be known as the carina. And this is an important radiological landmark because it can be helpful to identify when we split into the two lungs. And so looking at the bronchi, it's not demonstrated super well in this picture, but the right bronchus is going to be wider, shorter, and more vertical. And therefore, the left one is going to be narrower, longer, and more horizontal. And so, for this reason, if a foreign object, a piece of food or a toy or something, comes down your trachea, it's almost always going to go down into the right one because it's more of a straight shot down. Each bronchus, we're going to follow the bronchus now, the bronchi. Each bronchi is going to give off secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi. And then those are going to continue off and give off tertiary bronchi, which are also known as segmental bronchi. These segmental bronchi are each going to go out to the lung, and they're going to supply a bronchopulmonary segment. And so broncho, because we're bronchi, pulmonary, lung, segment. So bronchopulmonary segment. On the right side, the right lung, we're going to have 10 of these. And then on the left side, the left lung, we're going to have 8. And each of these segments, each of the bronchopulmonary segments, are going to have its own branch of the pulmonary artery and vein. And you might notice that I put artery in blue, vein in red, because we're going to be deoxygenated and oxygenated backwards from what we usually are in the veins and arteries. So now let's look at vasculature of the lungs. And so this is going to be really important when looking at the heart too, just keeping in mind where we're oxygenated, where we're not oxygenated. And that's demonstrated here in blue and red. And we'll follow the pathway later on. But we really have 4 main structures that we want to consider here. So we're going to have pulmonary artery and vein, and we're going to have bronchial artery and vein. Our pulmonary artery and vein are going to be related to breathing. So they're going to be the blood that we send to the lungs to get oxygenated, bring back to the heart, and distribute to the body. The bronchial artery and veins, those are going to be just for the lungs. So we're going to use those to send to the lungs to give the actual cells of the lungs oxygen. And so our pulmonary artery, those are going to come from the pulmonary trunk, which is coming out of the right ventricle. So we'll follow this in a second, but essentially we're going to come into our heart at the right atrium, go into the right ventricle, and then we're going to exit via the pulmonary trunk to go to each lung via the pulmonary arteries. And so the reason we're going to the lungs, remember, is going to be to gather oxygen in our blood. And so at this point, we're going to be deoxygenated blood that has just entered the heart. we're going to go to the lungs as deoxygenated blood, even though we're an artery. And the reason we're still termed artery, even though we don't have oxygen, is because we're traveling away from the heart. When we're traveling to the heart, we're going to be a vein. And these are really important because the pulmonary artery is the only artery in the body where we're going to have deoxygenated blood. And likewise, the pulmonary vein is the only vein in the body where we're going to have oxygenated blood. And so once our pulmonary arteries deliver blood out to the lungs, they're gonna get there by going through the root of the lung to the hilum, and they're gonna branch into these lobar and bronchopulmonary segments to each of the segments of the lungs. And so they're gonna do that. They're gonna travel through capillaries, go to veins, and they're gonna return to the heart. And so they're gonna bring oxygenated blood back to the heart now. And so from each lung, we're gonna have 2 veins. And you can see that here in this pinkish color. We're going to have 1, 2 on this side, 1, 2 on this side. And so we're going to have a left and right superior and a left and right inferior. On the left, the superior vein is going to drain the left superior lobe, because here we just have superior and inferior. On the right, the superior vein is going to drain the superior and middle. So you can think of the middle as kind of a weird extension of the superior in this case. Our inferior veins are just going to drain the inferior lobes on the right and left respectively. And so these are going to travel back to the heart and enter at the left atrium. Now moving back over to the bronchial arteries and veins. The bronchial arteries are going to supply the connective tissue of the bronchial tree. And they're going to be coming from the thoracic aorta. So looking at our aorta in the thorax, that's going to give off bronchial arteries that will go to the lungs. Bronchial veins, so once we're at the lungs, we want to get back to the heart. So we're going to drain from the bronchial tree. On the right side, we're going to enter the azygous system, the azygous vein, so you can look back at the previous video for that. And on the left, we're going to enter the hemiazygous vein. And then the last thing that we're going to look at the lungs here is lymphatics. So this is a really important section. As always with lymphatics, you want to know it pretty well, because if we get cancer in the lungs, which can be pretty common due to things like smoking, once it starts to metastasize, that's usually going to be through the lymphatic system. And so it's going to travel up here. Once we get here, we immediately have access to our blood vessels, our major blood vessels. We have access to go up to the head and neck. And so it can be a really, really clinically important place. And so looking at lymphatics of the lungs, we're going to have 2 plexuses. We're going to have a superficial plexus and a deep plexus. And that's kind of hard to distinguish in this picture, so I wouldn't worry about that. Just kind of get the idea. But our superficial plexus is going to be beneath the visceral pleura. So it's going to be wrapped around the fist, inside, like deep to the balloon around the fist. And so we're going to start as our superficial plexus out here, and we're going to go to our bronchopulmonary lymph nodes. And so I would try to avoid just memorizing all these and just kind of think about the pathway that we're going and look what you can get from the name. So we're going to be going first from our superficial plexus to the segment where the lungs connect to the bronchi. So that'll be our bronchopulmonary, broncho lungs. So superficial plexus, bronchopulmonary, and then we're going to go up to where the trachea connects to the bronchi. So that's going to be our tracheobronchial lymph nodes. We're going to travel up even more, and we'll reach where the bronchi connects to the mediastinum. So that'll be our bronchomediastinal lymph nodes. And those are then going to continue on the right through the lymphatic duct and on the left through the thoracic duct. So it might be a little bit of memorization, but for the most part, we're kind of just going to be traveling up this direction. So keep that in mind. With the deep plexus, we're going to be located in the submucosa of the bronchi and trachea. And so this one's a little simpler. We're going to be in the deep plexus. We're going to travel to our pulmonary lymph nodes. And then we're going to travel into the bronchopulmonary nodes, which you'll notice this is the same one here. and then that's just going to follow the same pattern up into the lymphatic or thoracic duct, which is going to drain pretty much everything back into the system. And so now let's move on and look at the heart. So in the cadaver lab, when you go to dissect the heart, you're going to get to it and you're going to see that it's got this wrap around it. And so it's been wrapped up like a present because it's really special to us. And so that's going to be called our pericardium. Peri meaning around, and cardium meaning heart. So around our heart, we have this Christmas wrapping. And so thinking back to our last video, we're in the middle mediastinum, which is part of the inferior mediastinum. And this is going to enclose the heart and some of the roots of the great vessels. Our great vessels are like our aorta, pulmonary trunk, superior vena cava. And so a couple things that we want to know here. We have our serous sac, and this is going to be a little more like embryologically relevant, but this is similar to like what we talked about with the lung pleura. It's going to be like an invagination into a balloon that's going to create this similar layer where we're going to have a parietal layer, a cavity, and a visceral layer. And these are going to be of pericardium. So we have our parietal pericardium, our pericardial fluid, and our visceral pericardium. And so that's the serous sac. And thinking about this, the coronary vessels that we'll talk about later, which are going to be our arteries and veins of the heart that go to actually supply the heart, those are going to be deep to the visceral layer. So those are going to be literally on the heart, so not around this outer wrapping. When looking at the pericardium, the outermost thing, so the thing you're going to see when looking at it, is going to be this thick fibrous layer, which is the fibrous pericardium. And so that's going to invest the external surface of the parietal layer. So that's this one here, you can see that. And it's going to inferiorly attach to the central tendon of the diaphragm. It's going to superiorly attach to the adventitial coverings of the great vessels. And then I also want to point out here our pericardial sinuses. And so we can kind of look inside the heart here. This is pretty simplified, but we're going to have two pericardial sinuses that we want to think about. We're going to have a transverse pericardial sinus, which is going to be up here. And we're going to have an oblique pericardial sinus, which is going to be right here. And what these are, they're formed by pericardial reflections during development and folding. So that's going to be here and here. And I would try and make a note to appreciate that in lab, go up and see if you can identify that. Okay, next, still looking at the pericardium, let's talk about arterial supply, venous supply, and innervation. So our arterial supply, it's going to be entirely through internal thoracic branches. So our internal thoracic, remember that's going to be our most medial branch of our subclavian. And so that's going to give off the internal thoracic, which is going to run down. You can see it here. And then that's going to give off branches that go to the pericardium. So our internal thoracic is going to give off a pericardiosophrenic vein, or artery, sorry. And so that can be seen here. And that's going to supply all this. We're also going to have a musculophrenic artery, which can kind of be pictured here. Veins, we're going to have some veins that run pretty much with those, and they're going to drain into internal thoracic veins, which makes sense because internal thoracic artery is how we got there, and into the azygous system. Innervation of the pericardium, we're going to be through the phrenic nerve and the cardiac plexus. The cardiac plexus is going to be made up of the vagal and sympathetic nerves. And again, we'll look at innervation of the thorax in another chapter, but just to kind of give you an idea, phrenic and cardiac plexus, this is going to be really similar to what we saw with the lungs. So our visceral pericardium, the innermost layer, will not be pain sensitive. Our parietal pericardium, the outermost layer, is pain sensitive. So we can feel pain most superficially. And so now, looking at this, let's take a scalpel. Let's carefully cut down here, cut down the bottoms, retract this out and remove it. And voila, we have the heart. So our heart, we're going to want to separate it into a few different regions just because we've got a lot going on here. And so when you're little in elementary school, you think of a heart as this shape that's like the love heart. And then you get older in middle school, high school, maybe college, and you think about the heart as kind of this oval shape, maybe with 4 chambers. That's going to be one at the top left, one at the top right, one at the bottom left, one at the bottom right, which is more accurate, but the heart's going to look a little bit different in real life. So if you got that like high school thought of a heart, you lay it down on its side and kind of flatten it out in a couple places, then we're going to have this pyramid looking shape. And it's going to stick out to the side, kind of into or towards the lung, and that's where we're going to get that cardiac notch in the lung. But we're going to have this posterior side that's going to be a little more flat, and then we're going to kind of bulge out here as the ventricles. And so our heart is going to have 4 borders, which are isolated here or drawn out here. On the right, we're going to have our right atrium. On the left, we're going to have our left ventricle. On the inferior border, we're going to have our right ventricle. And on the superior border, we're going to have the great vessels up here. You can also kind of see, if this helps you, we're going to have the base would be back here. And then you've got right, left, superior border, inferior. So it's kind of like a trapezoid, I guess this would be. And so next we want to break it apart into our 4 chambers. And so that's where we've learned right and left atrium, right and left ventricle. And so these are externally going to be defined by sulci. And what those are is they're going to be kind of like grooves or indentations that are going to separate these. And this is going to be the location, you can see down here, of the vessels that are going to supply the heart and receive deoxygenated blood from the heart and return it back. And so we have 2 main ones that we want to look at here. One is our coronary sulcus. So coronary, you'll see it a lot. We've got coronary arteries. We can also think maybe like the atria is a crown. So the coronary sulcus will separate the atria from the ventricles. So it's going to be the crown you put on your head. We also have interventricular sulcus. Inter meaning between, ventricular, ventricles. So this is going to be the sulcus between our ventricles. And you can see that here. And you can see that these regions, this is a lot what it's going to look like in lab, where you'll just see a lot of kind of fat lining these, and then our vessels are going to run down through it. And so now with the heart, you may have a background with this, but I want to quickly run through just the pathway that we're actually running through when we look at the heart. And so all of our blood from the body is going to be returning to the heart through veins. And we've looked at veins before, but they're going to approach this spot, and they're all going to kind of converge. And the upper part of the body is going to really primarily converge into the superior vena cava right here. And then all the lower body stuff is going to converge into the inferior vena cava. And so these 2 vena cava are going to flood into our right atrium. So we'll look at each chamber individually in a second, but the right atrium is going to be the entrance to the heart. And so we're going to flood into the right atrium, and we're going to kind of close all of our vessels, or all of our valves. And so we'll talk about valves more later too, but valves are going to be really, really important, because if we were just open all the time to all 4 chambers, then if we squeeze to contract and pump blood out, it's going to just get sent back to where it came, get sent all over the place. And so we want to have this controlled method of delivering blood to the lungs, back to the heart, and then out to the body without regurgitating or going back into the same spot. And so we'll enter the right atria. We're going to travel down to the right ventricle, which you can see here. So we're going to go atria, ventricle, and this blue part's we're deoxygenated right now. So once we're in the ventricle, we're going to start to contract and squeeze, and we're going to get pushed up through the valve and delivered out to the lungs. And the lungs will then oxygenate the blood. We're going to close the valve so nothing can go back. And the now oxygenated blood is going to return through the pulmonary veins, and those are both going to enter or all four, are going to enter at the left atrium. Once we enter the left atrium, we're going to kind of get squeezed down into the left ventricle. And this is going to be a really important chamber, and we'll talk about it because it's going to then squeeze and pump blood up through the aorta and distribute out to the entire body. And so let's start with the right atrium, as it's the entrance to the heart for all our blood. And so, like we talked about, the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava are going to flood into this. But we've also got a couple other things. So we're going to have a few anterior cardiac veins. So just like some small ones are going to flood into that. And then also our coronary sinus, which we'll look at later. You can't really see here, but that's going to flood into it as well. And so a couple structures we want to identify here. We're going to have our auricle, which I would definitely check this out in lab. It can be seen pretty well. It's going to be this like muscular pouch up at the corner. And this is part of the embryonic atrium. I would also look to identify the sulcus terminalis. And so this is going to be, not pictured super well, you could see it up here a little better. It's going to be this external landmark of the crista terminalis. And so this is the outside of our right atrium. Let's now take a scalpel, cut along here, and pull this flap back. And so that's going to leave us with this. So we cut around here, pull the flap back, and we're now looking inside the right atrium. And so we're going to have a good bit of structures in here. And I know this can look a little intimidating. There's a lot of words, a lot of stuff going on, but it's not actually as bad as it seems. And so these are both showing the same thing. This one just has a couple important structures colored in. And so the way that this is going to be separated, we're going to have this kind of rough anterior layer of the heart, and then of the right atrium, sorry, and then we're going to have a smooth layer. And so this rough layer is going to be rough because it's going to have all of these little muscle fibers. And so I guess anatomists probably saw this when they discovered it, and they said, oh, this looks like a comb or a rake or something like that. And so they looked at the Latin or Greek origin for that, or meaning for that, and they said, okay, comb-like means pectinate. Let's name these pectinate muscles. And so that's what they look like. We also have this smooth area, which is our sinus venerum. That's going to be over here. And this is going to be the location of the openings that are where the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus, are going to come into here. Next, we're going to have the crista terminalis, which we mentioned this briefly in the previous slide. This is going to be this ridge that runs up and separates the two vena cava, as well as the rough and smooth areas. So that's going to be running between that. I would definitely identify this in lab too, because this is going to have a really important landmark. If we follow it up to the top, we get up here. You're not actually going to be able to see this, but you'll know it's there. Our sinoatrial node, or our SA node, is going to be really, really important for conduction of electrical signals in the heart. And we'll look at that more later on, but this is going to be located in the superior part of the crista terminalis. And so, like I said, we can't see that, but there is a nerve, an SA nerve, that's going to go into it from the outside, and so you should be able to find that and kind of get an idea of where it's at. Also in here, we're going to have our interatrial septum. So between atria. So between our atria, that's going to have a septum that's separating the two atria. And so normally this is going to be kind of just a structure, but in congenital atrial septal defects, we can see that certain spots don't fully close, and so there can be a hole between the two structures. And this can be really bad because this will allow passage of blood between the two atria, which is obviously not going to be good because we have deoxygenated blood coming in here, and the other atria is going to have oxygenated blood. And so if we get those mixing up, then that's going to kind of not allow our body to have sufficient oxygen circling. And then we also have our atrioventricular orifice with our tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. So atrioventricular, from the atrium to the ventricle, there's going to be an orifice that has a tricuspid valve, So 3 cusps that's going to be where the blood is going to travel down into the ventricle. So we're going to go from the atrium now to the right ventricle here. And so we can see that here's our atrium, here's our ventricle. We've now cut this open to look at that. And so thinking about what's in here, when talking about our ventricle, our right ventricle, what did we say the function was? We said it's going to be to contract and push blood out through the pulmonary valve out to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk. And so looking at this, we're obviously going to have our pulmonary valve, which is going to be made up of 3 semilunar cusps, which will be left, right, anterior. And so just around that, we're going to have this structure called the conus arteriosus, which is going to be in the superior section of the right ventricle. And it's going to be this tapering shape towards this cone-like opening towards the pulmonary trunk. And so in here, we're going to have a smooth internal wall, and then the rest, all of this is going to be lined with these trabeculae carneae. And what these are irregular muscular bundles that are going to kind of line the ventricle. And so we're going to also have some structures here which are going to be papillary muscles. And so we're going to have anterior and posterior papillary muscles. And so you can see the posterior are going to be deep back here. The anterior are going to be more superficial here. And so what these are going to do, you can see down here it's kind of been unfolded. They're going to connect to 2 different cusps, 2 adjacent cusps by these tendinous cords or chordae tendinae. And they're going to contract and they're going to tether the cusps together, which will prevent regurgitation or backflow of blood. And we'll look at the mechanism for the valves a little bit more in, I think, the next slide. Also in here, we want to look at septomarginal trabecula. And so this could also be known as the moderator band, but we're going to have the interventricular septum, which is going to be between the ventricles. And then it's going to connect from there to the anterior papillary muscle. So what it is this kind of like fold or band really that's just, like I said, connecting the interventricular septum to this anterior papillary muscle that we talked about here. And why this is significant is because this is going to carry the right branch of the atrioventricular or AV bundle, which is going to be really relevant for conduction when we look at that. So now let's move over to the left atrium. So as you can see, things get a lot simpler here. So this is when we're returning from the lungs, the pulmonary veins are going to enter the left atrium, and we're going to have 4 pulmonary veins entering here, 2 from each lung, like we said. So you can see these 4. And so in the left atrium, we're almost all going to be this smooth layer, except for this one little part, which is going to be the auricle. And so the auricle will not be smooth. And so we're also going to have our left atrioventricular valve. And so atrioventricular, atrium to ventricle on the left side. And so that's going to be where we travel from the atrium down to the ventricle. This valve is also known as the mitral valve, and that's from the word mitre because it looks like the Pope's hat or a mitre hat, or it can also be known as the bicuspid valve. And so let's look back at this picture. So the blood's going to flow in through here, and we're going to kind of travel down into the ventricle where it's going to come up. And so if we cut out from this picture the atrium, we're now going to see this. So it's coming down here and moving up here. And so the left ventricle is going to be like the workhorse of the heart. In my opinion, it's one of the most important, maybe the most important, because it's got a really important job, which is when it contracts, it's got to send blood up through the aorta, which is going to then distribute blood to the entire body. And so, as you can imagine, the pressure in this and the left ventricle is going to have to be really, really high to be able to pump blood all the way throughout the body. And so looking at the inside, we're going to have a smooth superior region, which is going to be known as the aortic vestibule. And then the remainder of the chamber is going to be covered with the trabecular carneae that we talked about in the other region. And so we're going to have two large papillary muscles, which are going to do essentially the same thing that we talked about before, just with this mitral valve. And so we're going to have an anterior and posterior one for the two cusps. We're also going to have an interventricular septum. So interventricular between the two ventricles. That can be seen right here. That's going to separate the left and right ventricles. And so this is going to be clinically important because, like we talked about with the atrium, if we have a congenital ventricular septal defect, then we're going to have, that can cause a hole or a passageway between the two ventricles. And like we were saying, if we have a huge amount of pressure build up in here and not so much pressure in the right ventricle, then when we build that up, it's just going to shoot all of this oxygenated blood back into the left, or back into the right ventricle, which obviously would not be good, and we wouldn't be able to properly distribute blood throughout our body. Also in here, we're going to have our aortic valve. And so when we go to pump blood, we're going to travel up into the aorta through the aortic valve. And you can see here, we're going to have 3 semilunar cusps. And that's going to be left, right, and posterior. And so the function of this, just like all of them, is going to be when we pump blood out, we don't want it to leak back down into here. And pretty interestingly, you'll see here, pretty much as soon as we become the aorta, we're going to have these little holes here, which are going to be aortic sinuses. And those are going to go on to become the left and right coronary arteries. And so technically you could think of it as these are being, the left and right coronary arteries are the first branch of the aorta. And then going up more, we would see the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, so we've been talking about valves a lot. I just want to quickly kind of reiterate the function and further emphasize the function of the papillary muscles. And so let's look at like the mitral valve, for example, that we were looking at. We have 2 cusps, and so we're going to be traveling from the atrium down into the ventricle. And so when we're traveling down, we want this to be open. So blood's going down, it'll just easily pass through this. And in that case, the muscles will not be contracted, and the tendinous cords will be not strained. They'll be kind of loose. And so the blood will just easily pass through here, and that would be during diastole. When we're in systole, or when we want to pump blood, we don't want blood to be shooting back up through there. And so we contract, and the blood's going to shoot up, and it's going to start to push all of these back here. And so to prevent these cusps from just kind of folding out the other way and allowing the blood to flow through, then we're going to attach to these muscles, which are going to flex and tense up, and that's going to keep the cusps kind of locked in place and prevent regurgitation. And now I want to talk about heart sounds. And so the valves are obviously really, really important to making sure that proper blood flow goes throughout our heart and throughout our body. And so in the clinic, that's something you want to listen to. You want to make sure that people's valves are actually working properly. And so these are the spots that we're going to listen to when listening to the valves. But I also want to point out these are not the actual locations of the valves that we're going to listen to, because the valves will make a sound, but the blood is traveling so fast that you're going to see the blood travel through, and then you're going to hear it a little bit after the valve. So you can see these are going to circle where the valve actually is, and then this is going to be where we're going to listen to it. And so first we have the tricuspid valve, which is going to be T here. It's actually going to be located here, but we're going to listen to it down here. And so that's connecting the right atrium to the right ventricle, and we're going to listen to it at the 5th, or you could do the 6th intercostal space near the left sternal border, so right here. The bicuspid valve, or mitral valve, is between the left atrium and left ventricle, and so we're going to look at that down here. we're going to listen to that between the fifth intercostal space and the mid-clavicular line. So right here. The aortic and pulmonary valves are going to be pretty similar in location, so those are going to be those two. Those can be heard at the second intercostal space to the right or left borders of the sternum. And so a little mnemonic to remember these is going to be APTM, so apartment M. And so you can read that left to right, top to bottom, apartment M. Okay, and so now we've talked about the heart and the blood that's going to travel to it and where it's going to travel to, but now let's actually look at the blood that's going to be supplying the heart itself. And so the arteries of the heart, we're going to have two main ones that are really going to do everything, and they're going to give off some branches. And those are going to be our coronary arteries. We'll have a right and a left coronary artery. And we pointed out earlier how those are going to come from the aortic sinuses, just at the base of the aorta. And so we'll look at the right coronary artery first. And so I've got kind of a quick sketch that I gave here, which is not exactly accurate in how they would be, but it does give you an idea of the relationships with each other. So like what's going to anastomose, what's going to come off what, and stuff like that, just to give you a simpler idea. And so our right coronary artery, it's going to come down and it's going to give off one branch, which is our anterior right atrial branch. That is going to give off another tiny little branch that's going to be our sinoatrial nodal branch. So that's going to go to the SA node. We're going to keep going down. We're also going to give off a right marginal branch. And you can see this drawing we'll look at next, the veins, but some of these have veins that are going to accompany them, but we'll look at that later. Still on our right coronary artery, we continue down. We're going to give off an AV nodal branch, or atrioventricular. Keep going down, and then our terminal branch is going to be the posterior interventricular artery. Our left coronary artery is going to come from the left aortic sinus, which is going to be between the pulmonary trunk and the left auricle. And so it's going to come down, not as much going on, but we're going to give off a circumflex artery, and that's going to pass posteriorly in the coronary sulcus and anastomose with the posterior interventricular artery. We're also going to give off from the circumflex branch a left marginal branch, which will follow the left ventricle. Also on the left coronary artery, we're going to have the anterior interventricular artery. And that could also be known as left anterior descending, or LAD. But the anterior interventricular artery is going to come down here, and it's going to anastomose with the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, now we'll look at veins. They're a little bit simpler, and so for the most part, they're going to be running with arteries, but unfortunately, they don't really have the same names, and so you'll just kind of have to remember what goes with what. And so perhaps the most important one is going to be our coronary sinus, and so that's going to be this big guy right here. It should be pretty easy to identify on an actual heart in the cadaver lab, so be sure to check that out and look at its branches. But this is going to be the main vein of the heart, and it's going to directly feed into the right atrium. We also have veins that accompany arteries, but don't have the same name, like I said. And so the three main veins that we want to consider are going to be our great cardiac vein, our middle cardiac vein, and our small cardiac vein. Our great cardiac vein is going to run with the anterior interventricular. Our middle cardiac vein is going to run with our posterior interventricular artery. And then the small cardiac vein is going to run with the right marginal artery. There are also some small veins that are going to empty directly into the atrium. And we talked about that previously a little bit, but there's just some tiny anterior cardiac veins from the right ventricle that are going to feed into that. And then finally with the heart, the last thing we'll look at is the conducting system. And so we've seen how important it is that we don't just kind of like pump and squeeze everywhere, and that can happen clinically. It's obviously really, really bad if you've just got like contractions everywhere. So this isn't like our skeletal muscles where you want to just flex the whole muscle right away. because if you just flexed everything, that would shoot blood everywhere. And so what we want to have is this kind of methodic approach where we contract the atrium, send blood down, contract the ventricle, send blood out to the lungs, come back in, contract the atrium, go down, contract the ventricle, send blood out to the body. And so this is going to be done by conducting tissue, which are specialized myocardial fibers. So myo, muscle, cardial, heart muscle fibers. And so there are going to be three kind of major components in here that we're going to look at. First is the sinoatrial node, or SA node, that we've already mentioned a good bit. And that could also be referred to as our intrinsic pacemaker or a natural pacemaker, because it kind of starts the whole process. And when people in the real world need to get a pacemaker added, that's going to kind of supplement or replace this process because that's not functioning properly. And so we're going to have that. Over here, we're going to have our atrioventricular node. So that's going to be between the atrium and the ventricles. And then that's going to go down and give off the atrioventricular bundles, or the bundles of His. And so the pathway that this is going to work is that our SA node automatically, so we don't have to tell it to do that, it does it all on its own, is going to automatically depolarize. And this is going to initiate our regular rhythmic electrical impulse. And so we'll initiate that. The depolarization is going to spread through our atria to the AV node. And from the AV node, we're going to travel down through the AV bundles, which are first going to contract the papillary muscles. And so that's going to close or tighten the valves so we don't regurgitate back. And then it's going to contract the ventricles. So then we'll squeeze out to go to wherever we need to go. And then it's going to be the same process for this side. So when looking at the heart, it's also interesting to consider that we're not just going to be one thing at the same time. All four of these are kind of going to be active at the same time. So we're going to be like full, empty, full, empty. And so we're going to go down, down. So it'll have two things happening at once. To end the video, let's look at some clinical anatomy. And so first, when looking at the lungs, the apex of the lungs is going to be extending a little bit up into the neck, and that's going to be deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And so neck wounds can actually damage the lungs. And what happens is if you get something that pierces or damages that, then you can get pneumothorax or a collapsed lung. And what this is going to do is our pleural cavity, which regularly has a negative pressure, is going to go to atmospheric pressure. So all the air is going to flood into that, and our lung is going to collapse. We also want to look at pericardiocentesis. And what this is if our pericardium has fluid buildup in our pericardial sac, then we need to relieve pressure. And we're going to do that by inserting a needle to drain it. The downside is that this may restrict venous return, which is cardiac tamponade, but the place we're going to insert the needle is going to be in the left, fifth, or sixth intercostal space next to the sternum. And so this is going to be the location of the cardiac notch. So it in a regular person is going to be safe not to puncture the lung or anything like that. Similarly, we mentioned this previously, but we'll have a thoracocentesis, which is going to be when we need to drain the costodiaphragmatic recess. And that'll be done from the back. So that can best be accessed from the back because remember, like our inferior lobes and all this stuff is going to be most accessible from the back. And then finally, these last three, our SA node, we can consider it's going to get modulation can occur by both parasympathetic and sympathetic input from your cardiac plexus. We also want to think about the fossa ovalis, which is in the atrium. And so this is going to be the site of the embryonic foramen ovalis. And so what this does is it shunts blood from the right to the left side of the heart. And so we can see the atrial defects over here that we've been talking about. If we have lack of development here or here, then the bloods just kind of interchange. And so normally that's going to close after birth, but if not, then that can lead to atrial septal defects, which is going to just allow blood exchange here between deoxygenated and oxygenated. And what can happen here is this can lead to enlargement of the right side of the heart, because we're going to have a lot of blood coming in here and most of it's going to get forced back over here. So our right atrium and ventricle can get enlarged. And then finally, our coronary arteries, when looking at them on the heart, there's actually going to be a good bit of variation when looking at things. And so typically what you'll see is right coronary artery dominant, which is going to cross to the left side, and that's going to happen in about 70% of cases. And in that case, the right coronary artery is going to also supply the left side of the heart. About 20% of people are going to be left coronary artery dominant, which is going to cross to the right side. And in this case, then that vessel is also going to supply the right side. A little more rarely, so about 10% of cases, you'll see codominance. And then, as you can imagine, that's just going to be where both of them are kind of dominating the blood flow.